Good morning. Today we're going to start, we're going to continue with Chapter 10, the Cold War, and we're going to cover Part 5, the Cold War Grows. We just, from 1953 to 1959, we just did the Korean War, so now we're going to move into the period right after as the Cold War starts to escalate and get bigger and starts to, move around the world. So we're going to start looking into that. That's going to be the period. 1 second, I'm getting some iced tea here. Thank you, sweetheart. There she is. All right. Now, in 1953, Stalin dies. There he goes. He just disappeared. And here he is lying in his coffin. Stalin originally was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. He was a more moderate Soviet leader, and he's the one who takes over. There's a power struggle after the death of Stalin. Different people, it's kind of brutal. Some people are killed. And Nikita Khrushchev will now lead the Soviet Union through the next phase of the Cold War. Interesting enough, Stalin was originally buried in Lenin's tomb for 9 years. There he is. They were actually side by side. But in 1961, the Soviet Union set about a policy of what they call de-Stalinization. It was actually, they're removing Stalin's name and his statues from everything. And probably, of course, the most famous place to, they took his body out of the tomb. He's actually buried behind the Kremlin wall, right behind the tomb there. And probably the most famous place named after him was the city of Stalingrad, where the famous battle was fought, and they renamed it Volgograd after the river. So Stalin's name was taken off the city and was renamed. Interesting enough, there's been a current movement to rename Volgograd back to Stalingrad, not to honor Stalin, but to honor the famous battle that was fought there during the Second World War. Now, in 1953, we have a new president, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was elected right toward the end of the Korean War. And he's going to change the U.S. policy toward the Soviet Union. Now, he is helped by his Secretary of State, that's the man on the left there, John Foster Dulles. He has an airport named after him now. He's a big-time anti-communist, and he wants to, what he feels they can win the Cold War, and that's what they want to do. But they can't do it. They believe that Truman's policy of containment, remember Truman wanted to contain it, not let it grow? They felt it was too cautious. They're going to replace it now with what they call the rollback policy. They want to push communism back to actually ultimately defeat it. Spoiler alert, it never happens. Now in 1956, the Hungarians, who had been under communist control since the Soviet Red Army rolled in there during the end of World War II, rise up against the communist government. And there's a big revolution there against the communists, and they look to the United States to help them. Here we see they've taken over Soviet tanks. You can see crowds on the Soviet tanks flying Hungarian flags. But Eisenhower didn't want to risk a war with the Soviet Union. So instead of their rollback policy that they were so anxious to use, they went back to Truman's containment policy. They don't really do anything. And the Soviet army moves into Hungary and it crushes the uprising. Over 2,500 Hungarians and 700 Soviet troops were killed, and 2,000 Hungarians fled as refugees. Thousands of Hungarians were arrested, and ultimately 229 were executed. And led to a very strange incident in the 1956 Olympics, which were held down in Australia. A fight broke out between the Hungarian and Soviet water polo teams during one of their matches. So now we're seeing the Cold War in Europe has become a stalemate. We're not pushing them back. but they're not advancing anymore into areas that they didn't have before. Now, despite all the Cold War talk about the U.S. and the rollback of communism in Europe and the Soviet promises of an imminent triumph of communism, the failure of the uprising in Hungary was evidence that the Cold War in Europe had become a stalemate. Neither side was going to gain anything. Now I want to talk about Southeast Asia. Now, Indochina was a territory of the French and had been a colony of the French since 1887. In 1941, during World War II, the Japanese took control of French Indochina. It was one of the things that probably brought it back to the United States into criticizing the Japanese and eventually them realizing they would have to attack Pearl Harbor. So Indochina, excuse me. Now, in Indochina, there is an independence movement by the Viet Minh, led by a man named Ho Chi Minh. So he's trying to free and get rid of the French. Now, after Japan surrendered in 1945, France retook control of the colony. And in 1945, that same year, communist leader Ho Chi Minh starts a civil war in French Indochina to overthrow the French. Now in 1954, the French are defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and they pull out of Indochina. And one of the things they tell the United States is, don't go there. We don't listen. Here we see the victorious Vietnamese. This is a statue in Vietnam today commemorating the victory at Dien Bien Phu. Now, French Indochina was divided into three countries. We have Vietnam, you see it there in yellow, the kingdoms of Laos, it's up there in the north, and Cambodia in the south. This was the beginning of the end of the French colonies. Now we're going to talk about Vietnam. Vietnam is further divided into North and South. We see North Vietnam, the capital is Hanoi, and we see South Vietnam, the capital is Saigon. Now, the North is a communist government, led, of course, by Ho Chi Minh, and the South is a republic, at least it's supposed to be a republic. It's led by a man named Ngo Dien Diem. He wasn't a really nice guy. Now, the pro-communist forces in the South, these were the Vietnamese communists, and they were called the Viet Cong, and they start working to overthrow the South Vietnam government. Now, in 1955, Eisenhower sends military advisors to help Diem and the South Vietnam government against the communists or the Viet Cong. And obviously you see where this is going to end up. Now, Eisenhower believes in the what is called the domino theory. If one country falls to communism, it will lead to its neighbors falling to communism. You can see here pushing the one domino down: Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, Bangladesh, and you can see the Americans are going to try to prop those governments up and keep them from falling. Now, the U.S. was not very happy with Diem, the leader of South Korea. He was very corrupt, but basically there were no better alternatives. So we were stuck with him. Now, Diem is going to cause a lot of resentment among the Vietnamese peasants, and there's going to be a military coup in 1963, and Diem will be assassinated, and there'll be a military government will take over from there. Okay. Now I want to talk about Israel. Before World War II, there was no country called Israel. In fact, Israel hadn't been around since the time before the birth of Jesus. It had been part of the Fertile Crescent, and Palestine had been inhabited since the Bronze Age. It's the birthplace of Judaism and the birthplace of Christianity. In the 7th century, Palestine was conquered by the Islamic Caliphate, the Muslims. In 692, the Muslims built the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, on the spot where the Jewish temple was that had been destroyed by the Romans, and they built the Temple of the Rock on top of that. Now in 1516, the land was conquered by the Ottoman Turks and will stay under Turkish control until the end of World War I. The Ottoman Empire was on Germany's side in World War I, so after the Versailles Treaty was signed, you remember the Versailles Treaty, it was taken away from Turkey and it was now given to the United Kingdom, Great Britain. So the British will take control of the area and they will create what they call the Territory of Palestine. Now, during and after World War II, Jewish refugees from Europe, many of them were concentration camp survivors, fled to Palestine. The idea was to set up a country for themselves, for the Jews, even though the British really tried to stop them. The British did not want them to be under control because they were trying to balance control between the Arabs there and the Jews. These were Zionist Jews who wanted to build their own country. Now, this, of course, is going to cause a major conflict between the Zionist Jews and the British government who control Palestine. And the principal goal of Zionism is the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people. Now, Zionist terrorists bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in 1946. This was their 5-star hotel where the Prime Minister of Great Britain and other major people, whenever visiting Palestine, would stay there. This is where all the top leaders would go. It was the best hotel in Jerusalem. So they planted a bomb, blew up a part of the hotel, killed 91 people, and this will finally force Britain to leave Palestine to the Jews in 1948. They basically said, okay, we're out of here. So in 1948, May 14th, the Jews in Palestine declare the country of Israel. They create a flag, you can see here. The man in the background, that's a portrait of Theodor Herzl. He's a Hungarian Jew who is considered the father of modern political Zionism. Now, of course, their first president is David Ben-Gurion. But what I was going to say is, of course, with the creation of this new country of Israel, right in the middle of all these Arab nations, is going to cause a lot of tension between the Jews and the Arabs. They're not very happy that first Palestine was taken away and given to Israel, and they're right in the middle of a Muslim Arab territory. So 4 of the countries actually come together: Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, which today, of course, is the country of Jordan, and Iraq, start what is called the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Here we see some Israeli tanks. These were actually British tanks the Israeli government purchased from Britain, fighting against these 4 Arab countries, and no one expected the Israelis to win. But they do. Here we see some Israeli soldiers, women, men. Everyone fought for them. This was actually considered the Israeli War of Independence, because had they lost, they would have been, they wouldn't have been a country of Israel. So by them winning their new flag, they've now created this country of Israel, right in the middle of the Middle East. Now, the West supported Israel, but worked to keep the other countries from becoming communist. This was a very tricky balance. You had to be careful not to let the Arab countries turn to communism while you were supporting Israel, because this was the constant conflict of the Cold War. We wanted to support Israel, but we didn't want to see Egypt and Iraq and all of them, and the Soviets were sending them equipment. The Egyptians, the Transjordan, the Syrians, and the Iraqis all had Soviet-made tanks and planes that they were using against Israel. But the United States was very careful to make sure we kept supporting them too, so that they wouldn't become communist countries. We had to keep, the big goal in mind. Now we're going to talk about the arms race. Both the US and the Soviet Union struggled to gain a weapon superiority. The arms race dealt with having basically more nuclear weapons. Now, in 1952, the US and then later the Soviet Union explode a hydrogen bomb. This was known as the H bomb as opposed to the A bomb. It was 450 times more powerful than the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. Now, in March of 1954, the US test basically explodes a hydrogen bomb in the Bikini Island in the South Pacific. Here we can see what it looks like. I actually have a little video here, which I will show you. Here we go. All those little black things you see out in the water there are actually naval vessels. Most of them World War II vessels that were left over after World War II. Trying to get this. It'd be nice if I could actually include the video in it, but I can't. So the best I can do is do this. So there we go. This actually is a good video of it showing it blowing up. Making what becomes known as the mushroom cloud. The mushroom cloud is the, as you can see here in the photograph, is the cloud that is above the explosion, and it forms kind of the shape of a mushroom. All right. Now the US is going to conduct 19 of these test explosions between 1954 and 1958. Now, up to the late 1950s, the United States is going to rely on these large, long-range jet bombers known as the B-52. They were huge. The B-52 Stratofortress was produced in 1952, and some are still in use today. Now, to give you an idea of how big they are, you can see the size of one of them here compared to over here, everyone's favorite anatomy and physiology teacher from Hudson Catholic. And you can see the size there. Of course, Mrs. McGee was about to fly into the bomber and take off. And okay, no, she wasn't. But you can see the difference. You can see how huge these planes were. All right, just erase that there. And let's keep moving on. Now, in the late 1950s, the Soviet Union and the US developed long-range rockets with nuclear weapons, which were called ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. We still have them today. There you see, they would fire out of these underground silos. We'll talk about that in a minute. Both sides used rocket technology taken from the Nazis after World War II. The US had a top Nazi rocket scientist named Wernher von Braun, who had developed a V-2 rocket program for Nazi Germany. We brought him back to the United States, and he was now developing rockets for us, for the United States. This was one of his test rockets. Now, the U.S. will develop the Minuteman missile system in 1962. It had a range of 8,100 miles, so from the United States, it could reach the Soviet Union. And it had what they called multiple re-entry things, where the rocket itself would actually have, you can see different bombs would break off from it, and you could hit multiple targets from just one missile. So that made it even more dangerous. Now this here shows one of the underground silos. We built these all around out west, Arizona, up in the in Nebraska, Kansas, up in the Dakotas. You see on the right here, this here we see the rocket, all right? Over here, this was the area where the, usually it was a two-man crew would sit there, and they'd be the ones who would be responsible for firing the rockets. This over here was where the living conditions when they weren't on duty. So these things were below the ground. You can see up here is the desert floor. You entered here, go down the steps, and you can see, and I'll show you some pictures, to get into the room, the control room, they had these gigantic, large doors. But before I get there, let me just erase this so they're not in the picture. Okay. Here we see the missile. This was right below the surface. They had these large blast doors over them. And these were the doors. These doors would be closed when the men were in the control room. There were usually two of them. They would stay in there. And these doors were known as blast doors. So if there's a bomb lands on the desert floor above, they would survive and they'd be still able to fire their missile. So you go through there and you go into the command center. And there we said, oh, look at there. There's that biology teacher again. She has her finger on the button. I don't know. I feel a little better knowing it's Mrs. McGady there with the button, not some lunatic. Now, in 1962, the United States developed the Polaris missile that could be fired from submarines. These were nuclear missiles that could actually be fired from underwater. So, the United States and the Soviet Union developed what is called the nuclear triad. Triad means three. So basically, it's a nuclear arsenal with three components. We have the B-52 bombers that could drop nuclear bombs on enemy targets or enemy cities. We have the ICBM missiles that could fire out of the ground. They go across the North Pole and land in the Soviet Union. And then finally, three, we have the nuclear submarines. These would have Polaris missiles. They'd be underwater. They could get very close to the target. The scary thing is that firing one of these missiles, they could hit the target within 5 minutes. So you would have like no warning whatsoever to, get someplace safe. Not that there were many places that were safe from nuclear missiles. Now, this is where it gets a little bit crazy. The Western view of the deployment of this system was a strategic theory of what we called mutual assured destruction. In other words, if the Soviet Union will destroy our country, we will destroy their country. And of course, with so many nuclear weapons, the whole world would be destroyed. So the idea is we have enough weapons that if they try to destroy us, we will destroy them. So mutually assured destruction. It's very crazy. Now, this is the idea that the use of nuclear weapons would cause the complete annihilation of both the defender and the attacker. So this develops the policy of deterrence. Deterrence was the idea that there are so many weapons that you can never hit them all. You would deter anyone from using them. So in other words, if we have so many nuclear weapons and the Soviets have so many nuclear weapons, they will never attack us and we will never attack them because we know that both sides would be destroyed. All right, I don't know about you, but I see something a little bit crazy about that. But that's what we did. And it was very scary because all you need was a mistake and it could be all over. All right, the last thing we're going to cover is the space race. In 1957, the Soviets launched the first satellite to orbit Earth called Sputnik. This is the actual sound the Sputnik made when it circled the Earth. It only went around the Earth a number of times, but it scared a lot of Americans who were looking up into the sky. Now, the U.S. is embarrassed by being beaten into space. And it decides at this point now, we're going to commit to a space program. There it goes. Now, we need to do better because we always, pride ourselves as Americans as being, technology, advanced. And we were, very upset the Soviets were the first ones to go into space, put a satellite into space before we did. So now the rush will be, to get a man into space. Now to do that, we create, in 1958, we create the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, also known as NASA. We have the former Nazi rocket scientist Werner von Braun joined NASA to work on the Saturn V rockets that would eventually put a man on the moon in 1969. Von Braun also developed the idea of a space camp that would train children in the fields of science and space technology. Space camp still goes on today. In fact, a number of students from Hudson Catholic have actually gone to space camp. It's held down in Alabama in Huntsville. Now, we didn't win the first man in space, unfortunately. In 1961, the Soviets put the first man in space, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. He was launched in the Soviets' Vostok 1 and made one orbit around the Earth. America was not happy. We really were hoping to get the first man in space. The problem we had is that the Russians cut corners that we weren't going to do. We were determined to have the first man. Eventually we would do that. Man go into space and get him back alive. The Russians wanted to do that too, but they were willing to take more shortcuts than we were willing to do. The Russians weren't as, I wouldn't say they weren't as concerned about getting Gagarin home, but they were, they wanted to win this space race, so they were going to take, be less cautious about it. And ultimately they do win and they do get the first man in space. But the United States will put the first man on the moon. All right, so that ends this section on the Cold War. The Cold War expands. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got a little something out of it. It was kind of interesting. And enjoy the rest of your day. Beautiful day out, and hope you enjoy it. All right, take care.